Imagine the early 19th century world. The oceans are busy, crowded with wooden ships that cross entire continents. They carry cotton, tea, machinery, and coal. But deeper in their cargo is something far more powerful than any physical good. They carry the rules of a new financial world. These vessels move not only commodities, but also a set of principles that will decide which nations will rise and which will never catch up. It is as if every ship carries an invisible recipe, one that promises stability while quietly sorting winners from losers. At the center of this recipe is gold, a metal that has no voice, no ideology, no purpose beyond what humans assign to it. Gold does not grow. It does not multiply. It does not produce anything. Yet during this period, it becomes the foundation of global wealth. Nations begin to link their currencies to fixed amounts of gold, turning the metal into a standard that can decide the fate of entire economies. The paradox is stark. A substance that simply sits in vaults becomes the most influential player in world finance. This raises a tension that feels almost impossible. How did a system built on a metal that does nothing become the core of industrial progress and international power? How could a static object, locked in underground reserves, dictate whether a country could build railroads, borrow money, or pay its workers? As trade expands and capital begins to flow across borders, some countries find themselves lifted by the certainty that gold provides. Others discover that the same certainty works against them. It limits their options, restricts their ability to respond to crises, and exposes them to pressures they cannot control. In the markets of London, in the counting houses of Amsterdam, and in the commercial ports of New York, merchants and bankers trust gold as the final measure of value. They believe it creates order. For them, gold makes promises credible and debts enforceable. But on the other side of these powerful centers, smaller and poorer nations start to notice that this same rule book forces them into patterns that are difficult to escape. A fixed currency tied to gold means that their economic choices become narrow. Balancing trade, managing interest rates, and protecting employment all become constrained by a metal that does not care about human needs. The central question emerges with increasing clarity. Was the gold standard truly a stabilizing invention that brought discipline and predictability to the global economy? Or was it an elegant trap disguised as fairness? A system that looked neutral, but actually locked entire nations into roles defined by those who already controlled trade and finance. The story begins on the decks of those 19th century ships, and it leads to a world where the silent weight of gold shapes the destinies of millions. In the early 19th century, Britain becomes the loudest engine on Earth. The smoke of its factories darkens the sky, and the sound of machinery echoes across entire cities. Textiles, iron, coal, and manufactured goods flow outward from its ports in every direction. London stands at the center of an expanding commercial empire, and the success of this empire depends on a constant stream of predictable international payments. British merchants are selling to every continent, but they face a growing problem. Every country uses its own currency, values fluctuate, and uncertainty threatens to slow the entire system. In a world that is scaling faster than ever before, unpredictability becomes dangerous. Inside London counting houses, merchant financiers begin to demand a solution. They want a currency that everyone will trust, something that can serve as a final measure of value, no matter where a shipment is headed. They need a standard that foreign buyers and foreign sellers cannot dispute. At the time, Britain already uses gold coins in domestic circulation, but the structure is not yet fully formalized. The challenge is to take this national practice and turn it into an international foundation. The idea that emerges is simple in appearance and powerful in consequence. Link the British currency to a fixed weight of gold. make the promise explicit. One unit of currency equals a specific, legally defined quantity of metal. In 1816, Parliament passes the Coinage Act that confirms gold as the sole standard for British money. Silver is still minted, but no longer defines value. This step does not immediately create a global system, but it establishes the rule that will soon spread far beyond British shores. The Bank of England becomes the guardian of this new monetary order. Its obligation is straightforward. If someone brings banknotes to the bank, they must be able to exchange those notes for real gold at the official rate. This convertibility functions like a guarantee of honesty. It signals to the world that British money is not backed by political promises alone, but by a scarce and universally respected metal. For merchants engaged in long-distance trade, this is exactly what they need. A fixed gold value removes uncertainty about future payments. A contract written in British pounds becomes as reliable in Shanghai or Bombay as it is in Liverpool. This predictability reduces transaction costs, eliminates many disputes, and allows the British financial system to scale with remarkable speed. London becomes the safest place to hold capital because the value of British money appears anchored, disciplined, and credible. The decision to embrace gold is not made for fairness. It is made to reduce risk for the most advanced commercial empire of the time. Britain has the largest industrial base, the most extensive trade networks, and the deepest financial markets. A fixed gold standard works in its favor because it stabilizes the environment in which British merchants operate. The system places discipline on other countries that wish to interact with Britain. They must adapt to British rules if they want access to British credit and British buyers. The underlying incentive becomes clear. If a foreign government wants its currency to be accepted in London, it must prove that its money is also anchored to gold. This is not stated openly as a requirement, but it becomes the practical reality. A nation whose currency fluctuates or is not convertible into gold faces higher borrowing costs in international markets. Investors hesitate. British merchants demand discounts or avoid contracts altogether. Countries begin to discover that participation in global trade now has conditions attached to it. What starts in Britain as a domestic monetary reform begins to push outward across the world. The message is simple but powerful. To trade with the largest industrial power, others must adopt similar rules. Once Britain defines money in terms of gold, it triggers a chain reaction. Nations that want access to global capital must anchor their own currencies to the same metal, or risk being isolated from the emerging financial network. This quiet transformation marks the beginning of a monetary system that will reshape the international order for more than a century. In the decades after Britain defined its currency through gold, the idea begins to spread outward with surprising speed. Each adoption happens for its own political and economic reasons, but together they form a pattern of nations locking themselves into the same metallic logic that now governs British trade and finance. Germany provides one of the most important early examples. After unification in 1871, the new German Empire seeks a currency that will match its rising industrial power. Victory in the Franco-Prussian War gives Germany a large indemnity payment in gold, and this becomes the foundation for a full commitment to the gold standard. The move is not only symbolic, it signals that the new empire intends to participate in world trade as a major power, rather than a fragmented collection of states. This decision influences its neighbors and rivals. If Germany uses gold, others fear that remaining outside the system will leave them exposed to currency volatility and higher borrowing costs. France follows soon after, despite having historically used a bimetallic framework that linked money to both gold and silver. The war with Germany and the economic pressure that follows highlight a new reality. Gold has become the anchor of the emerging international order. By formally aligning with gold, France seeks stability and credibility in global markets. The transition is gradual but decisive. It reflects both strategic necessity and the recognition that financial influence is now tied to the ability to maintain convertibility. Across the Atlantic, the United States faces its own path toward gold. Throughout the mid-19th century, the country debates silver money, paper money, and various hybrid systems. After the Civil War, these debates intensify. Investors and major trading partners prefer a stable and internationally recognized standard. And by the 1870s, the United States begins to move firmly toward gold convertibility. The Gold Standard Act of 1900 formalizes a process that had been underway for decades. With this commitment, the United States strengthens its ability to attract global capital and to integrate more deeply into world markets. As more nations join the gold system, a clear incentive structure forms. Countries that adopt gold gain easier access to British credit and lower interest rates in global finance. Countries that remain outside face suspicion from investors. Their currencies are labeled unpredictable, and contracts written in their money require higher risk premiums. In effect, the gold standard becomes a gateway into the industrial race. To compete with Britain and other advanced economies, countries must play by the same rules. Otherwise, they risk economic isolation. At the same time, international finance begins to take shape as a force that disciplines governments. Bankers in London, Paris, and Berlin use gold convertibility as a test of responsibility. A government that suspends convertibility sends a clear signal that it is struggling or unwilling to maintain monetary discipline. Investors respond by withdrawing funds. This pattern becomes a recurring feature of the era. If a country wants access to global capital, it must protect its gold reserves and maintain its parity. Failure leads to capital flight, rising interest rates, and economic stress. Colonial expansion then reinforces the system even further. Colonies do not choose their monetary standards. Their currencies are pegged to the money of imperial powers, which are themselves tied to gold. This creates a hierarchy that extends the logic of the gold standard into large parts of Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. Local economies are pushed into trading relationships and financial patterns defined in European capitals. The design is not accidental. It ensures that imperial trade remains predictable and that colonial currencies cannot drift away from the interests of the metropole. Crises in the late 19th century add another layer of reinforcement. The Long Depression, beginning in 1873, pressures governments across the industrial world. Many suspend gold convertibility temporarily. But each time the same conclusion emerges. Investors treat suspension as a sign of instability. Countries that return to gold regain access to credit, and those that delay are punished with higher borrowing costs. The Panic of 1893 in the United States repeats this dynamic. Confidence collapses when investors fear that the United States might abandon gold. Only a reaffirmed commitment restores stability. By the early 20th century, the gold standard has become more than a monetary framework. It is a global compliance mechanism. The system rewards nations that protect their gold reserves and punishes those that deviate. Governments, whether powerful or fragile, learn that the rules of money are no longer purely domestic choices. They are part of an international structure where credibility is measured in metal and where participation requires surrendering a degree of monetary autonomy. Under the classical gold standard, every currency was defined by a fixed weight of gold. A British pound, a French franc, or a German mark all corresponded to a precise quantity of the metal. This meant that central banks could not print money freely. Their role was rigid and demanding. When gold flowed out of the country due to trade deficits or speculative pressures, central banks had to respond. They could raise interest rates, making borrowing more expensive and slowing domestic spending. They could cut government expenditures, reducing deficits, but also limiting growth. These were not policy preferences, but enforced responses dictated by the rules of gold. Trade imbalances created automatic adjustments. Nations that imported more than they exported experienced a net outflow of gold. As reserves shrank, the domestic money supply contracted, leading to deflation. Prices fell, wages stagnated, and unemployment rose. For countries with strong industrial bases or large financial centers, these adjustments were tolerable. Britain in the 19th century or the United States after the gold commitment of 1900 could absorb shocks because their economies produced surplus goods and attracted capital. They were the winners in this system. For countries with smaller industrial output, weaker banking systems, or less diversified trade, the consequences were harsh. The rules of gold left them no room to maneuver. They were forced into austerity, often at the expense of growth and social stability. Even after the gold standard ended, its logic did not disappear. Strong currencies continue to dominate international lending and trade. Reserve currencies like the US dollar hold privileged status, giving their countries cheaper access to capital and influence over global financial flows. International institutions such as the International Monetary Fund enforce discipline through conditional loans, effectively echoing the old gold standard principle that monetary stability requires constraints on government spending and borrowing. Emerging markets often face limits on how freely they can manage their currencies, a modern reflection of the old imbalance between creditor nations and debtor nations. The pattern is consistent. Countries with access to deep capital markets, financial centers, and strong institutions are rewarded. Nations without these advantages are constrained. They must maintain strict fiscal and monetary policies or risk losing access to investment and trade finance. The fundamental dynamics remain the same as under gold: fixed values, external discipline, and the leverage of creditors over borrowers. The rules now operate through institutions, markets, and conventions, rather than gold bars stored in vaults. The analytical thread becomes clear. The gold standard was never just a historical curiosity. It established a framework of incentives that persists. Creditor power, predictable value, and enforced discipline are baked into the architecture of global finance. The metal itself is gone, but the hierarchy it produced survives. Nations continue to operate in a system that rewards those with surplus and influence and constrains those without. The gold standard died in name, but the machine it created is still running, invisible yet powerful, shaping the possibilities of policy and power around the world. The modern world offers a striking contrast. On one side of the screen, gleaming financial capitals rise like monuments to wealth and power. London, New York, Tokyo, and Frankfurt dominate global finance. Towering banks, stock exchanges, and investment funds pulse with activity that seems abstract but is rooted in centuries-old rules. On the other side, emerging and smaller economies struggle under perpetual currency stress. Inflation, debt crises, and volatile capital flows limit their options. The divide is not just visible in statistics or charts. It is encoded in the very architecture of global finance, shaped by principles first formalized under the gold standard. Reserve currency nations maintain advantages that go far beyond their borders. The United States, whose dollar functions as the dominant global currency, can borrow cheaply and influence the cost of capital worldwide. Other nations follow suit with the euro, the yen, and the pound, forming a core of financial power that defines international lending, investment, and trade. These countries retain the leverage to set interest rates that affect the global economy and to influence the terms of international aid and loans. Their position is a direct legacy of the gold standard logic. Being the issuer of a trusted, widely accepted currency confers enormous structural advantages. Meanwhile, smaller economies face the consequences of a system they cannot fully control. External shocks, such as sudden capital flight or commodity price swings, trigger crises that force governments into austerity, currency devaluations, or policy concessions to foreign creditors. Debt becomes the new form of gold, an instrument that enforces discipline without any physical metal. Loans are accompanied by conditions, often compelling structural reforms that prioritize market stability over domestic priorities. Sovereignty over economic policy becomes conditional, tied to the willingness to obey rules crafted elsewhere. The trap is subtle but persistent. Nations left the gold standard decades ago, yet the mindset it created endures. The belief that stable money requires sacrificing economic autonomy continues to dominate policy thinking. Countries that try to depart from conventional financial orthodoxy risk punishment by investors, rating agencies, and international institutions. The same incentives that disciplined governments in the 19th century now operate through global capital markets and financial instruments. The logic of gold, once physical and visible, is now abstract but just as powerful. Understanding this system reveals a deeper truth. The gold standard was never simply a monetary choice. It was a template for hierarchy. By embedding fixed value, external discipline, and creditor leverage into the rules of trade and money, it created a world where the powerful define the system and the rest are compelled to comply. Stability for some comes at the expense of autonomy for others. Participation in global finance is not optional. It requires adherence to rules designed for the benefit of the strongest players. The final insight is both simple and chilling. The machine of global finance was never broken, and it has never been neutral. It was engineered deliberately to create winners and losers, to reward surplus and power, and to discipline dependence. The gold may no longer be stored in vaults, but the hierarchy it produced continues to operate invisibly. Every capital flow, every interest rate decision, and every loan condition reflects the enduring logic of a system designed to maintain inequality, disguised as order. The world moves, trades, and borrows within a framework built long ago, and the invisible levers of this machine still pull nations in the directions determined by history, power, and gold.